Chapter 10. The Battle for the Conservative Party. When I arrived back in London on the 8th of July, after the G20 ministers meeting in Bali, the Friday following Boris's resignation, my house was already filled with a motley crew of advisors and friends eager to get behind my nascent leadership campaign. We set to work. That weekend, we had a lot of MPs over for chats, and I recorded my campaign launch video in the back garden. Why was I standing to be leader? I felt compelled to. I knew that without Boris's charisma or any bold policy changes, we risked pushing our country and our party into a cul-de-sac. I had a very clear idea of what needed to be done. I'd been thinking about these things for over a decade. This was the last chance to change Britain in a positive way before the next general election. I had come into the conclusion that there wasn't anyone else who both shared this vision and could win. I was also being egged on by my supporters who wanted a champion of conservative ideas to run. However, not everyone was so positive. My husband Hugh said it would be impossible to lead the party given the level of infighting and nihilism demonstrated by the removal of Boris. The Conservatives were too divided to back any divisive course of action, he said. But even Hugh, who predicted it would all end in tears, accepted that this was the moment I was expected to run, and that if it didn't, people would say I had bottled it. Ian Sherwood, my political agent in my Norfolk constituency, also thought I should run, but he thought it would be for the best if I came second. There is no doubt I was underprepared, both for the contest and for the prospect of winning. Unlike some, I had not been spending my time in government plotting a leadership bid. I'd always become engrossed in the job I was doing to the exclusion of almost everything else. This was true, whether I was dealing with floods or hammering out trade deals. By this point, as Foreign Secretary, the job was 24/7, and all the more so since the start of the war in Ukraine. I might occasionally have discussed the political situation with my special advisors or close friends, but the notion of standing for leader had remained a distant prospect. What I really lacked was any kind of political infrastructure that could help me deliver the radical transformative program Britain needed. This was partly because the British system tends to underfund and shut out political expertise. The people who shared my beliefs generally did not have government experience or understand how the system operates, and the people who do understand how the system operates genuinely do not want to change it. So, in the absence of such an operation, the enthusiastic group in my house became my core team. We were playing catch-up due to my enforced sojourn in Bali. The focus at this stage of the contest was on Conservative MPs, who had whittled down the various candidates to a final two to be put to a vote of several 100,000 grassroots party members. I gave the team, assembled at my house in Greenwich, a pep talk. Misquoting Superintendent Hastings from the BBC police drama Line of Duty, I said, "There's only one thing we care about, and that's Tory MPs. Hastings, of course, only cares about bent coppers." There were 358 Conservative MPs at that time. The leadership candidates would be winnowed down through a series of exhaustive ballots, with the lowest performing candidate excluded after each round. To guarantee a place among the final two, I would have to secure the support of 120 MPs in the last round. After that, it would go to a national-wide vote of Conservative members, who would have the final say on the new leader. The centre of gravity of the Conservative Parliamentary Party is significantly to the left of party members in the country, on pretty much every issue, and during my nearly 14 years in Parliament, I have noticed a further shift to the left. MPs who used to talk about limited government and cutting regulation have increasingly been championing net zero, pushing for gender self-identification and opposing fracking. Sometimes this is because they haven't told the truth when getting selected by their local parties. While beating their chests and calling for free markets and controlled immigration in the selection meetings, they vote the opposite way when they get to Westminster. These shapeshifters are Conservatives in name only, or CINOs, CNOs. It's certainly true that others have gradually moved to the left during their parliamentary careers, away from normal daily life in Britain and surrounded by pressure groups and lobbyists for causes that more often than not demand more state intervention or higher government spending. Their political compasses go faulty. Twitter has shortened attention spans, and MPs are intimidated by social media storms. Operating in the world of Whitehall and Quankos, where leftism is the prevailing ethos, it can be easy to think that this is the way of the world. And with backbench and ministerial positions not being particularly well paid, the prospect of a well-remunerated cooperative job after service in politics is attractive. They are thus influenced to appease or adopt leftist positions. COVID had meant most MPs were away from the parliamentary estate for much of 2020 and 2021, as a socially distanced chamber could only accommodate a fraction of our number. Hybrid sittings with video links became the temporary norm. This had a particularly disruptive effect on the 106 Conservative MPs who were newly elected in December 2019, many of whom were swept in when we captured the so-called Red Wall of seats formerly held by Labour. They were isolated at home and had been given little time prior to the pandemic to get to know and work directly with their new colleagues. Much of Westminster politics is conducted in the members' tea room and the members' smoking room, although the Labour government's blanket ban on smoking indoors put paid to this ever again being a smoke-filled room. It is in these places that thoughts and ideas are shared, political friendships are developed, and a sense of camaraderie is built. WhatsApp groups, on the other hand, seem to promote mutiny, as we had already seen with the divisive removal of Boris. British political parties are broad coalitions, and there have always been Conservative MPs who happily place themselves to the left of the party's centre. Margaret Thatcher had to deal with the Wets, and ultimately they had to be removed from her office. They tend to describe themselves as one nation Conservatives, and they believe in state paternalism rather than full-blown socialism, a traditional embodied by former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. There is a strong sense of noblesse oblige about it, and in the modern era, a good dose of liberal guilt too. A common refrain of these Tories is, what we need to be on the right side of history. They are therefore much more willing to defer to supposedly independent institutions and accept the prevailing orthodoxy in government and the public sector. For remaining close to the EU, to being pro-China, they don't really want any change to the status quo. A less charitable interpretation is that they are engaged in appeasing the left. There are then Conservative MPs who are on the right on matters like immigration, net zero and wokeism. As the Conservative Party has secured new seats in the north of England, there have been a growing focus on these issues. However, some of these MPs are under the impression that merely tinkering with an already bloated state can help back tradition, families, or revive industry. Under this belief, having big government isn't necessarily antithetical to being a conservative. It just needs to be a conservative big government. This is a forlorn hope. If government grows too big, it inevitably seeks to replace families, parents, free markets, businesses, and communities. And the UK's government is already spending 46% of GDP. Just how much bigger should it get? While I share this desire to take on wokeism, redistributionism, and the worst excuses of the environmental movement, I believe fundamentally that this is the best driven by individuals and families, not the government. Those of us who believe in popular conservatism, or a modernized version of Thatcherism, believe in the nation state, low taxes, and individual responsibility. My description above implies there are a number of logical groups among conservatives. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Conservative Party is a constantly swirling constellation affected by current events and electoral geography. Its members differ on key issues like net zero, but they also differ on approach. Whether or not the governance of Britain needs a shake-up, or whether what is competent technocracy, are Britain's institutions part of the solution or part of the problem? The party can also reflect different backgrounds. Those from humbler origins or who made self-made tend to rail more against the cooperatist establishment. They feel the hunger to succeed and the pain of the odds being stacked against them by the state, public subsidies, and cronyism. The battle over popular influence has been raging in Britain since the dawn of democracy. Elements of the establishment have tried to prevent the widening of the political process from including the mass of the population. Victorian grandees, such as the Conservative Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, were highly critical of the growth of democracy, arguing that it would lead to chaos and the rule of the mob. Similarly, arguments were made against extending the franchise to working-class voters. While it's unacceptable to make such overtly anti-democratic and elitist arguments today, many of the same underlying attitudes persist. The new elites are not just in Parliament, but in the permanent administrative state and its associated institutions. Within these, there is an almost contemptuous disregard for party politics and the popular will. We saw this with the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump in the US. In both cases, a popular uprising was resisted by public officials and the wider political establishment. Of course, there need no be checks and balances in place in any political system, and civil servants should always be able to offer honest and unvarnished advice to politicians. But there also has to be an understanding that democracy means allowing people to choose the leaders and the policies they wish. Too many Conservatives understand the need to win popular support for policies in elections, but have a distaste for the views of many of their supporters. They see popularism as a threat that needs to be contained. When it comes to internal party democracy, their attitude towards the views of the Conservative membership is similarly contemptuous. They privately consider it to have been a huge mistake to widen the franchise for the election of the party leader to rank-and-file members. Much of the leadership election of the summer of 2022 was about this divide. I was of the view that the UK needed significant change and that we needed to be proud of being Conservatives. In particular, I believed the economic orthodoxy of low growth, high taxes, and high spending funded by the government's printing money and artificially suppressing interest rates was unsustainable, and it needed to be ended as soon as possible. This would mean challenging the economic establishment, including the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility, and the Bank of England. We also needed to be tougher on China and Russia, and play hardball with the EU. I argue that without urgent change, we were heading for declining living standards and electoral defeat. Although my eventual opponent in the runoff, Rishi Sunak, tacked most towards my position on a number of issues, namely China and taxes, he was fundamentally the candidate of the status quo. He had run British economic policy for the previous 2.5 years. He argued that by continuing with existing policies, we could avoid interest rate hikes, runaway inflation, and low growth, and that merely through competent management, he could put the Conservatives back on the right path. Winning over MPs was an uphill struggle. It was a classic exercise in political intrigue and gamesmanship, as the rival campaigners sought to sign up parliamentarians. This involved me in a constant round of meetings and phone calls. With colleagues from across the party seeking their support, I knew this would be the toughest part of the process and that if it would, it could get through it. I would have a very good chance with the membership. To be self-critical, I think it's fair to say I have perhaps not spent enough time during my career listening to and empathizing with my parliamentarian colleagues, and I probably have not done a very good job of hiding what I think about some of them either. Now, I was thrown into a speed dating exercise, in which I was required to meet and listen to any MP who wanted some of my time. One, for instance, was on the phone with me for half an hour, methodically running through a list of questions, including seeking my view on a certain type of technology. Others wanted to stick with groups of their friends and came to me to see together, listing their pet policy issues and making clear that I was satisfied with them. They would back me. It was pure political horse trading. If that felt grubby and transactional, it was nothing compared by those who nakedly sought to trade their votes for promises of future advancement. Some did this in a roundabout way, telling me, for example, of skills they had recently learned that they felt would make them a good minister. Others were utterly brazen about it. I got a text message from one MP who told me he wanted a particularly ministerial job, with a specific list of responsibilities and a seat in the cabinet. It ended with, "Please confirm you agree to this." I did not. Amid all this, I was aware my team was playing at a considerable disadvantage compared to our rivals in the Sunak campaign. While my campaign had been thrown together in a hurry and consisted of my handful of special advisors and a few long-standing allies, Sunak had a well-resourced and well-staffed operation from the outset. It was hard not to conclude that his lieutenants had been preparing for this contest for quite some time. Experienced former chief whips, senior ministers, and party grandees had been signed up long ago, and had been doing the rounds of MPs well in advance of Boris's resignation. This played its part in bringing down the Prime Minister, with rumours abounding that junior ministers and ministerial aides were being told by figures on the Sunak campaign team in those final couple of days after Rishi had resigned that if they wanted a place on the new team, they would have to join the revolt against Boris and step down at once. Many duly did. The ruthless tactics that had been used to help bring down Boris were now turned on Sunak's rivals for the leadership. While there was never any suggestion that Rishi himself indulged in such behaviour, reports were circulating that MPs were cajoled and pressured by some of his most zealous bankers, as well as backers, with not particularly subtle threats that if they didn't sign up, they would be permanently out in the cold. I learned that it was the same story in 2005, when the hard-nosed team around David Davis, the early favourite in that year's leadership contest, made similar threats to ambitious colleagues about their future careers if they didn't back their man. He too ended up coming second. There was also the suspicion of even less savoury activities. A dossier was circulating among journalists containing offensive personal fictions about me, while other malicious gossip began to do the rounds. While the provenance of all this was shrouded in mystery, my team had to spend precious time and responding to even the most ludicrous of these false allegations. As well as individual meetings, there was a plethora of hustlings for different groups of MPs, the European Research Group, the One Nation Caucus, the Conservative Environmental Network, the Northern Research Group, and so on. Generally speaking, I outperformed expectations here. Spending 10 years in government and regularly being sent onto the airwaves to give voice to the line on any number of questions that might arise is useful training for knowing about every policy issue. In particular, I had very clear ideas on how to deal with the EU that appealed to Eurosceptics. The whole parliamentary hustings process demonstrated just how many fractions the parliamentary party had divided into. Many historic issues were raised. My overriding focus was on the economic situation, but I got the impression that many MPs simply didn't understand what a mess we were in. As well as matters of policy, some of them were simply interested in knowing how I planned to win the next election. Or, more accurately, how I would keep them in their seats. There were also debates on Channel 4 and ITV, which I found hair-raising. I'd never done a TV debate before in my life, and I hadn't had time enough focused practice beforehand. Partly because everything had been so frantic, with the endless meetings around Parliament, I hadn't given a second thought to my outfit. Everyone else was slicker and more polished. Afterwards, I could just tell by looking at my team's faces that they thought I had bombed. I was put straight in an urgent boot camp led by Rob Butler, an MP and former broadcaster who was far scarier than anyone ended up interviewing me for real. The pussy bow blouse I'd worn for the first debate was banned. Kwasi Kwarteng, a close friend and political ally also from the 2010 intake of MPs, advised having half a glass of wine before going on air. I put in a better performance during the second debate. The weather during these weeks was stifling hot for Britain, up to 40 degrees Celsius, and the lack of air conditioning meant Parliament was particularly stuffy and airless. It all added to a feeling of claustrophobia and simmering tension. This initial stage of the contest took place over the course of a week, with 5 ballots of MPs between the 30th and 20th of July. At each stage, the lowest scoring candidate was eliminated, and there followed further machinations between the remaining candidates to secure the eliminated candidates' support and votes of their supporters. It was all very tense, and as ever, there were some very Machiavellian tactics being employed. Brackets, or should I say Machiavellian. Close brackets. On the final MP's ballot, Sunak secured the most votes with 137, while I narrowly secured second place with 113, to Penny Mordaunt's 105. This was rather closer than I had anticipated from our private tallies of supporters, proving the eternal truth of Tory leadership contests. Conservative MPs comprised the most duplicitous electorate in Christendom. My support, therefore, equated to slightly less than 1/3 of the parliamentary party. Some backed me because they firmly believed in my agenda, others because they liked me personally, and some because they disliked Sunak and his team. It was enough to get me onto the final ballot, but it was a rather fragile coalition on which to rely. This was later to become a significant problem. I was relieved to have made it through this notorious and torturous Westminster ordeal and to be able to take my case to party members in the country. I was confident I would beat Sunak, and opinion polls of members quickly showed I was the firm favourite. My biggest worry had been about getting through the parliamentary stage of the contest, where I knew my support was weaker. Now I felt very much confident of victory. The campaign moved outside Westminster, with 6 weeks of hustlings and events around the country, including 2 more television debates to add to those that had taken place during the parliamentary rounds. There were far too many such events scheduled, with the party organisation having gone completely overboard. It became something of a circus, particularly with the debates. In the meantime, the problems were piling up in the Downing Street in-tray and storm clouds were gathering over the British economy. And of course, the public was being viciously exposed to all the splits within the Conservative Party. I thought the length of the process and the exposed public nature of it was extremely damaging. Alongside the defenestation of Porus, this prolonged period of infighting irreparably damaged the party in the polls. The debates were the worst part. I'm always happy to debate policy, but the one-on-one format was terrible and encouraged blue-on-blue attacks. I found it a complete ordeal and had to be pumped in the green room beforehand, often with a soundtrack of Queen and Whitney Houston hits. The debates seemed more about character analysis than serious policy. One topic that came up was the fact that I get my earrings at Claire's Accessories, the budget high street jewelry shop beloved of teenagers. This was interrupted as an attempt by me to be a woman of the people. In fact, it's simply because I hate the idea of getting my ears pierced and Claire sells clip-ons. I may have been dreading the debates, but one person who fared even worse was Kate McCann, who hosted the debate on Talk TV. While I was answering a question on live television, she fainted on the podium. The debate was immediately abandoned, with huge concern over what had happened to her. Mercifully, she was fine, but the whole episode, which took place on my birthday, only added to the surreal nature of the contest. Throughout the campaign, I found the personal attacks hard to stomach, as well as completely unnecessary. I am used to being shot at by the Labour Party and by commentators, but to hear colleagues I had worked with for years describe me variously as immoral or an electoral suicide note was very upsetting. I shut myself off from the media because I just couldn't take it. Whereas in previous contests there had been efforts to avoid trashing the party's brand, the assault on my policies was personal and no holds barred. The best bits of the campaign were when I spoke to party members in gardens, football clubs, church halls and pubs. I felt liberated to rip off the government lines to take document and say what I really thought for the first time in years. The positive response showed that the grassroots and I were in tune with each other, on everything from solar farms, I hate them, to women not having penises, to quangos, being too powerful, to taxes being too high. We were on the same page. In town after town, I found Conservative members rooted in their local areas understanding what needed to be done far better than the party's HQ focus groups. A particular highlight was the GB News event at the Bedford Sports and Social Club in Leigh, hosted by veteran broadcaster Alistair Stewart. Leigh, a northern industrial town on the outskirts of Manchester, was one of the new seats we had gained at the 2019 election for the first time ever. And my policies got a great response from the invited audience. Composed mainly of local Conservative members, it gave me hope that this policy agenda had public appeal. I was clearly winning the argument with the members, but the campaign itself was not all plain sailing. My campaign team was run by Mark Fulbrook and my long-serving advisor, Ruth Porter, along with a collection of my other special advisors and allies. Without time to prepare, everything had to be done on the hoof. We were building the car at the same time as we were driving along. I was never in the campaign HQ myself, as I was constantly on the road going from event to event, accompanied by aides, most of whom I had only just met. I felt like I was not in control and just had to trust them to get on with it. This led to some missteps, most notably when a press release was sent out without my knowledge, raising the prospect of regional pay bargaining in the public sector, which caused a furore and had to be awkwardly disavowed. That was perhaps the trickiest moment, and the Sunak team invariably made hay with the error. Compared to my opponent's slick operation, we had less time to prepare detailed briefs. That was fine in one sense, because I had spent years thinking about this agenda and had long been making these arguments in private. It all came off naturally. But it left me feeling like a one-man band, the policy person, the front man, and the organizer. I was often working off the cuff. It was a frustrating and isolating experience. To make it worse, while I was traversing the UK, Hugh, Francis, and Liberty were enjoying the holiday I had booked and organised in Florida. They sent me daily pictures of themselves relaxing on the beach, riding roller coasters, or eating unfeasible large stacks of pancakes. Until the final hustings event was done, I couldn't properly relax, despite the polls continuing to give me a solid lead. Only as we entered the last couple of weeks was I able to turn my attention to planning for the likely prospect of victory. I was staying at Sheving during those closing stages, and it was there that we started a round of discreet meetings with senior civil servants to prepare for the transition to power. I spent hours talking through plans with my senior aides and close allies like Therese Coffey and Kwasi Kwarteng, who were set to become my Deputy Prime Minister and Chancellor respectively. On Monday the 5th of September, I waited with my team in one of the many concrete rooms of the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre in the heart of Westminster. Sunak and his team were also there. Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, who was acting as returning officer, asked Sunak and me to each bring one person to hear the result. I brought Hugh, and Sunak brought Oliver Dowden, the MP chairing his leadership campaign. Brady told us I had won the leadership contest by 81,326 votes to Sunak's 60,399. I commiserated with Sunak, and he congratulated me. I was very pleased to win, and it was a huge relief just to have ended the uncertainty. But as always, my mind raced ahead to what I would have to do next. I was to make a speech to the large audience of MPs and party members who were waiting downstairs. I knew that every word I uttered and every move I made would be under the microscope. We all went downstairs to a packed hall full of the official announcement. Once the result had been publicly revealed, I took to the stage to make my acceptance speech and declared, "I know that our beliefs resonate with the British people, our beliefs in freedom, in the ability to control your own life, in low taxes, in personal responsibility, and I know why people voted for us in such numbers in 2019. And as your party leader, I intended to deliver what we promised those voters right across our great country. During this leadership campaign, I campaigned as a Conservative, and I will govern as a Conservative. My friends, we need to show that we will deliver over the next 2 years. I will deliver a bold plan to cut taxes and grow our economy. I was hugely proud to have been elected leader of the oldest and most successful political party in the Western world, but I knew there would be battles ahead. In choosing me as leader, the Conservative Party had voted for bold action and a clear direction. My campaign might have been messy, but it had chimed with the instincts of the membership. They had ultimately rejected technocracy. Where the Conservative rank and file might have placed their faith in me, my colleagues in Westminster were another story. A majority of them had supported my rivals in the final MP's ballot, and a significant number of them had remained actively opposed to me. It seemed that even though the votes had been counted, significant elements of the Sunak leadership campaign had not given up. I had difficult decisions to make about appointing a cabinet and the wider team of almost 100 other ministers. There were a lot of people who considered themselves to be current cabinet ministers, all the existing ones plus those who had resigned from cabinet jobs very recently. There were also other contenders in the leadership election, all of whom had put in a good performance and were impressive people. And to that, the fact that during 13 years in government, many MPs had felt that they were unfairly passed over a promotion or unfairly sacked. It was impossible to please them all. During the bruising leadership campaign, I had frankly lost trust in many of the erstwhile ministerial colleagues who were supporting my opponent. They had spent the last 6 weeks not just attacking me, but seeking to undermine my plans, saying my agenda was unworkable, and even after it was clear their candidate wasn't going to win, they carried on trashing me and the Conservative brand. Sunak himself had made it clear he didn't want to roll. I was very doubtful that I could trust some of the others on his team, or that they would be prepared to implement the Conservative agenda on which I had been elected. Their outright hostility had made it almost impossible for me to appoint them. So I put together a team of trusted allies, including some people who had been rivals in the leadership election, like Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch, and also some Sunak supporters who I believed were capable and willing to serve conscientiously in my administration. Frankly, I never want to see another reshuffle board again in my life. Yes, the British government really is appointed with the aid of the whiteboard and dozens of post-it notes. Of course, it was impossible to include everyone, and no doubt there were good people I left out. There were others who were going to be a problem inside or outside the tent. I knew there would cause me trouble from the backbenches, but I thought it wouldn't be able to get anything done with them inside the government. So it was that I would now embark on my ambitious agenda as Prime Minister, with a starkly divided party. I had got through the leadership election with a hastily assembled team who had delivered an impressive victory against the establishment favourite. We were a small band of insurgents with big ideas for change. With a mandate from the membership, I was now going to set about implementing my agenda. Even if my parliamentary colleagues had reservations about it, I expected them to at least respect my right to deliver what I'd promised. The campaign had ultimately been a success, but for me, it had highlighted some of the major issues facing the Conservative Party. The fact that my agenda was seen as controversial by a number of its leading figures was profoundly worrying. For years, I had been concerned that in both the UK and the US, the Conservative and Republican parties had lost their way and been outgunned by the left. Sound principles of smaller government and lower taxes seem to have fallen out of fashion. Too often, the left has been appeased. How has this happened? And what can we do about it? Both parties urgently need to find their way back to a position where they can recapture the kind of electoral support they enjoyed in the 1980s. It seems to me that on both sides of the Atlantic, a good place to start is by rediscovering the winning economic formula that drove success over the course of that decade. That was what I was trying to prompt the Conservative Party to do in 2022. What the leadership contest revealed, however, was how out of step many in Parliament were with the views of the wider membership. In the battle between Democrats and technocrats, the Democrats seemed to have won. But as I was to discover, The technocrats had the full force of the administrative state on their side.